The little sisters sat around me. Lydia volunteered to answer anything I wanted to ask her. I asked her to tell me about her gazing into Don Juan's power spot, but she didn't understand me. "I'm a distance and shadow gazer," she said. "After I became a gazer, the Nagual made me start all over again and had me gaze this time at the shadows of leaves and plants and trees and rocks. Now I never look at anything anymore. I just look at their shadows. Even if there's no light at all, there are shadows. Even at night, there are shadows. Because I'm a shadow gazer, I'm also a distance gazer. I can gaze at shadows even in the distance. The shadows in the early morning don't tell much. The shadows rest at that time, so it's useless to gaze very early in the day. Around 6 in the morning, the shadows wake up, and they're best around 5 in the afternoon. Then they're fully awake." "What do the shadows tell you?" "Everything I want to know. They tell me things because they have heat or cold, or because they move, or because they have colors. I don't know yet all the things that colors and heat and cold mean. The Nagual left it up to me to learn." "How do you learn?" "In my dreaming. Dreamers must gaze in order to do dreaming, and then they must look for their dreams in their gazing. For example, the Nagual made me gaze at the shadows of rocks, and then in my dreaming I found out that those shadows had light, so I looked for the light in the shadows from then on, until I found it. Gazing and dreaming go together. It took me a lot of gazing at shadows to get my dreaming of shadows going, and then it took me a lot of dreaming and gazing to get the two together and really see in the shadows what I was seeing in my dreaming. See what I mean? Every one of us does the same. Rosa's dreaming is about trees because she's a tree gazer, and Josefina's is about clouds because she's a cloud gazer. They gaze at trees and clouds until they match their dreaming." Rosa and Josefina shook their heads in agreement. "What about La Gorda?" I asked. "She's a flea gazer," Rosa said, and all of them laughed. "La Gorda doesn't like to be bitten by fleas," Lydia explained. "She's formless and can gaze at anything, but she used to be a rain gazer." "What about Pablito?" "He gazes at women's crotches," Rosa answered with a deadpan expression. They laughed. Rosa slapped me on the back. "I understand that since he's your partner, he's taking after you," she said. They banged on the table and shook the benches with their feet as they laughed. "Pablito is a rock gazer," Lydia said. "Nestor is a rain and plant gazer, and Benigno is a distance gazer. But don't ask me any more about gazing, because I will lose my power if I tell you more." "How come La Gorda tells me everything?" "La Gorda lost her form," Lydia replied. "Whenever I lose mine, I'll tell you everything too, but by then you won't care to hear it. You care only because you're stupid like us. The day we lose our form, we'll all stop being stupid." "Why do you ask so many questions when you know all this?" Rosa asked. "Because he's like us," Lydia said. "He's not a true Nagual. He's still a man." She turned and faced me. For an instant, her face was hard and her eyes piercing and cold, but her expression softened as she spoke to me. "You and Pablito are partners," she said. "You really like him, don't you?" I thought for a moment before I answered. I told her that somehow I trusted him implicitly. For no overt reason at all, I had a feeling of kinship with him. "You like him so much that you fouled him up," she said in an accusing tone. "On that mountaintop where you jumped, he was getting to his second attention by himself, and you forced him to jump with you." "I only held him by the arm," I said in protest. "A sorcerer doesn't hold another sorcerer by the arm," she said. "Each of us is very capable. You don't need any of us three to help you. Only a sorcerer who sees and is formless can help. On that mountaintop where you jumped, you were supposed to go first. Now Pablito is tied to you. I suppose you intended to help us in the same way. God, the more I think about you, the more I despise you." Rosa and Josefina mumbled their agreement. Rosa stood up and faced me with rage in her eyes. She demanded to know what I intended to do with them. I said that I intended to leave very soon. My statement seemed to shock them. They all spoke at the same time. Lydia's voice rose above the others. She said that the time to leave had been the night before, and that she had hated it the moment I decided to stay. Josefina began to yell obscenities at me. I felt a sudden shiver and stood up and yelled at them to be quiet with a voice that was not my own. They looked at me, horrified. I tried to look casual, but I had frightened myself as much as I had frightened them. At that moment, La Gorda stepped out to the kitchen, as if she had been hiding in the front room, waiting for us to start a fight. She said that she had warned all of us not to fall into one another's webs. I had to laugh at the way she scolded us as if we were children. She said that we owed respect to each other, that respect among warriors was a most delicate matter. The little sisters knew how to behave like warriors with each other, so did the Janaros among themselves, but when I would come into either group, or when the two groups got together, all of them ignored their warriors' knowledge and behaved like slobs. We sat down. La Gorda sat next to me. After a moment's pause, Lydia explained that she was afraid I was going to do to them what I had done to Pablito. La Gorda laughed and said that she would never let me help any of them in that manner. I told her that I couldn't understand what I had done to Pablito that was so wrong. I hadn't been aware of what I had done, and if Nestor hadn't told me, I would never have known that I had actually picked Pablito up. I even wondered if Nestor had perhaps exaggerated a bit, or that maybe he'd made a mistake. La Gorda said that the witness would not make a stupid mistake like that, much less exaggerate it, and that the witness was the most perfect warrior among them. "Sorcerers don't help one another like you helped Pablito," she went on. "You behaved like a man in the street. The Nagual had taught us all to be warriors. He said that a warrior had no compassion for anyone. For him, to have compassion meant that you wished the other person to be like you, to be in your shoes, and you lent a hand just for that purpose. You did that to Pablito. The hardest thing in the world is for a warrior to let others be. When I was fat, I worried because Lydia and Josefina didn't eat enough. I was afraid that they would get ill and die from not eating. I did my utmost to fatten them, and I meant only the best. The impeccability of a warrior is to let them be, and to support them in what they are. That means, of course, that you trust them to be impeccable warriors themselves. But what if they're not impeccable warriors? I said. Then it's your duty to be impeccable yourself and not say a word, she replied. The Nagual said that only a sorcerer who sees and is formless can afford to help anyone. That's why he helped us and made us what we are. You don't think that you can go around picking people up off the street to help them, do you? Don Juan had already put me face to face with the dilemma that I could not help my fellow beings in any way. In fact, to his understanding, every effort to help on our part was an arbitrary act guided by our own self-interest alone. One day, when I was with him in the city, I picked up a snail that was in the middle of the sidewalk and tucked it safely under some vines. I was sure that if I had left it in the middle of the sidewalk, people would sooner or later have stepped on it. I thought that by moving it to a safe place, I had saved it. Don Juan pointed out that my assumption was a careless one. because I had not taken into consideration two important possibilities. One was that the snail might have been escaping a sure death by poison under the leaves of the vine, and the other possibility was that the snail had enough personal power to cross the sidewalk. By interfering, I had not saved the snail, but only made it lose whatever it had so painfully gained. I wanted, of course, to put the snail back where I had found it, but he didn't let me. He said that it was the snail's fate that an idiot crossed its path and made it lose its momentum. If I left it where I had put it, it might be able again to gather enough power to go wherever it was going. I thought I had understood his point. Obviously, I had only given him a shallow agreement. The hardest thing for me was to let others be. I told them the story. La Gorda patted my back. "We're all pretty bad," she said. "All 5 of us are awful people who don't want to understand. I've gotten rid of most of my ugly side, but not all of it yet. We're rather slow, and in comparison to the Genaros, we're gloomy and domineering. The Genaros, on the other hand, are all like Genaro. There is very little awfulness in them." The little sisters shook their heads in agreement. "You're the ugliest among us," Lydia said to me. "I don't think we're that bad in comparison to you." La Gorda giggled and tapped my leg as if telling me to agree with Lydia. I did, and all of them laughed like children. We remained silent for a long time. "I'm getting now to the end of what I had to tell you," La Gorda said all of a sudden. She made all of us stand up. She said that they were going to show me the Toltec warrior's power stand. Lydia stood by my right side, facing me. She grabbed my hand with her right hand, palm to palm, but without interlocking the fingers. Then she hooked my arm right above the elbow with her left arm and held me tightly against her chest. Josefina did exactly the same thing on my left side. Rosa stood face to face with me and hooked her arms under my armpits and grabbed my shoulders. La Gorda came from behind me and embraced me at my waist, interlocking her fingers over my navel. All of us were about the same height, and they could press their heads against my head. La Gorda spoke very softly behind my left ear, but loud enough for all of us to hear her. She said that we were going to try to put our second attention in the Nagual's power place without anyone or anything prodding us. This time, there was no teacher to aid us or allies to spur us. We were going to go there just by the force of our desire. I had the invincible urge to ask her what I should do. She said that I should let my second attention focus on what I had gazed at. She explained that the particular formation which we were in was a Toltec power arrangement. I was at that moment the center and binding force of the 4 corners of the world. Lydia was the east, the weapon that the Toltec warrior holds in his right hand. Rosa was the north, the shield harnessed on the front of the warrior. Josefina was the west, the spirit catcher that the warrior holds in his left hand. And La Gorda was the south, the basket which the warrior carries on his back and where he keeps his power objects. She said that the natural position of every warrior was to face the north, since he had to hold the weapon, the east, in his right hand. But the direction that we ourselves had to face was the south, slightly toward the east. Therefore, the act of power that the Nagual had left for us to perform was to change directions. She reminded me that one of the first things that the Nagual had done to us was to turn our eyes to face the southeast. That had been the way he had enticed our second attention to perform the feat which we were going to attempt then. There were 2 alternatives to that feat. One was for all of us to turn around to face the south using me as an axis, and in so doing change around the basic value and function of all of them. Lydia would be the west, Josefina the east, Rosa the south, and she the north. The other alternative was for us to change our direction and face the south, but without turning around. That was the alternative of power, and it entailed putting on our second face. I told La Gorda that I didn't understand what our second face was. She said that she'd been entrusted by the Nagual to try getting the second attention of all of us bundled up together, and that every Toltec warrior had two faces and faced two opposite directions. The second face was the second attention. La Gorda suddenly released her grip. All the others did the same. She sat down again and motioned me to sit by her. The little sisters remained standing. La Gorda asked me if everything was clear to me. It was, and at the same time, it was not. Before I had time to formulate a question, she blurted out that one of the last things the Nagual had entrusted her to tell me was that I had to change my direction by summing up my second attention together with theirs and put on my power face to see what was behind me. La Gorda stood up and motioned me to follow her. She led me to the door of their room. She gently pushed me into the room. Once I had crossed the threshold, Lydia, Rosa, Josefina, and she joined me in that order, and then La Gorda closed the door. The room was very dark. It didn't seem to have any windows. La Gorda grabbed me by the arm and placed me in what I thought was the center of the room. All of them surrounded me. I couldn't see them at all. I could only feel them flanking me on four sides. After a while, my eyes became accustomed to the darkness. I could see that the room had two windows which had been blocked off by panels. A bit of light came through them, and I could distinguish everybody. Then all of them held me the way they had done a few minutes before, and in perfect unison they placed their heads against mine. I could feel their hot breaths all around me. I closed my eyes in order to sum up the image of my gazing. I couldn't do it. I felt very tired and sleepy. My eyes itched terribly. I wanted to rub them, but Lydia and Josefina held my arms tightly. We stayed in that position for a very long time. My fatigue was unbearable, and finally I slumped. I thought that my knees had given in. I had the feeling that I was going to collapse on the floor and fall asleep right there. But there was no floor. In fact, there was nothing underneath me. My fright upon realizing that was so intense that I was fully awake in an instant. A force greater than my fright, however, pushed me back into that sleepy state again. I abandoned myself. I was floating with them, like a balloon. It was as if I had fallen asleep and was dreaming, and in that dream I saw a series of disconnected images. We were no longer in the darkness of their room. There was so much light that it blinded me. At times, I could see Rosa's face against mine. Out of the corner of my eyes, I could also see Lydia's and Josefina's. I could feel their foreheads pressed hard against my ears. And then the image would change, and I would see instead La Gorda's face against mine. Every time that happened, she would put her mouth on mine and breathe. I did not like that at all. Some force in me tried to get loose. I felt terrified. I tried to push all of them away. The harder I tried, the harder they held me. That convinced me that La Gorda had tricked me and had finally led me into a death trap. But contrary to the others, La Gorda had been an impeccable player. The thought that she had played an impeccable hand made me feel better. At one point, I didn't care to struggle any longer. I became curious about the moment of my death, which I believed was imminent, and I let go of myself. I experienced then an unequaled joy, an exuberance that I was sure was the herald of my end, if not my death itself. I pulled Lydia and Josefina even closer to me. At that moment, La Gorda was in front of me. I didn't mind that she was breathing in my mouth. In fact, I was surprised that she stopped then. The instant she did, all of them also stopped pressing their heads on mine. They began to look around, and by doing so, they also freed my head. I could move it. Lydia, La Gorda, and Josefina were so close to me that I could see only through the opening in between their heads. I could not figure out where we were. One thing I was certain of, we were not standing on the ground. We were in the air. Another thing I knew for sure was that we had shifted our order. Lydia was to my left and Josefina to my right. La Gorda's face was covered with perspiration, and so were Lydia's and Josefina's. I could only feel Rosa behind me. I could see her hands coming from my armpits and holding onto my shoulders. La Gorda was saying something I couldn't hear. She enunciated her words slowly, as if she were giving me time to read her lips, but I got caught up in the details of her mouth. At one instant I felt that the four of them were moving me. They were deliberately rocking me. That forced me to pay attention to La Gorda's silent words. I clearly read her lips this time. She was telling me to turn around. I tried, but my head seemed to be fixed. I felt that someone was biting my lips. I watched La Gorda. She wasn't biting me, but she was looking at me as she mouthed her command to turn my head around. As she talked, I also felt that she was actually licking my entire face, or biting my lips and cheeks. La Gorda's face was somehow distorted. It looked big and yellowish. I thought that perhaps since the whole scene was yellowish, her face was reflecting that glow. I could almost hear her ordering me to turn my head around. Finally, the annoyance that the biting was causing me made me shake my head, and suddenly the sound of La Gorda's voice became clearly audible. She was in back of me, and she was yelling at me to turn my attention around. Rosa was the one who was licking my face. I pushed her away from my face with my forehead. Rosa was weeping. Her face was covered with perspiration. I could hear La Gorda's voice behind me. She said that I had exhausted them by fighting them, and that she didn't know what to do to catch our original attention. The little sisters were whining. My thoughts were crystal clear. My rational processes, however, were not deductive. I knew things quickly and directly, and there was no doubt of any sort in my mind. For instance, I knew that I had to go back to sleep again, and that would make us plummet down. But I also knew that I had to let them bring us to their house. I was useless for that. If I could focus my second attention at all, it had to be on a place that Don Juan had given me in northern Mexico. I had always been able to picture it in my mind like nothing else in the world. I didn't dare to sum up that vision. I knew that we would have ended up there. I thought that I had to tell La Gorda what I knew, but I couldn't talk. Yet some part of me knew that she understood. I trusted her implicitly, and I fell asleep in a matter of seconds. In my dream, I was looking at the kitchen of their house. Pablito, Nestor, and Benigno were there. They looked extraordinarily large, and they glowed. I couldn't focus my eyes on them because a sheet of transparent plastic material was in between them and myself. Then I realized that it was as if I were looking at them through a glass window while somebody was throwing water on the glass. Finally, the glass shattered, and the water hit me in the face. Pablito was drenching me with a bucket. Nestor and Benigno were also standing there. La Gorda, the little sisters, and I were sprawled on the ground in the yard behind the house. The Genaros were drenching us with buckets of water. I sprang up. Either the cold water or the extravagant experience I had just been through had invigorated me. La Gorda and the Little Sisters put on a change of clothes that the Genaros must have laid out in the sun. My clothes had also been neatly laid on the ground. I changed without a word. I was experiencing the peculiar feeling that seems to follow the focusing of the second attention. I could not talk, or rather, I could talk, but I didn't want to. My stomach was upset. La Gorda seemed to sense it and pulled me gently to the area in back of the fence. I became ill. La Gorda and the Little Sisters were affected the same way. I returned to the kitchen area and washed my face. The coldness of the water seemed to restore my awareness. Pablito, Nestor, and Benigno were sitting around the table. Pablito had brought his chair. He stood up and shook hands with me. Then Nestor and Benigno did the same. La Gorda and the Little Sisters joined us. There seemed to be something wrong with me. My ears were buzzing. I felt dizzy. Josefina stood up and grabbed onto Rosa for support. I turned to ask La Gorda what to do. Lydia was falling backward over the bench. I caught her, but her weight pulled me down and I fell over with her. I must have fainted. I woke up suddenly. I was lying on a straw mat in the front room. Lydia, Rosa, and Josefina were sound asleep next to me. I had to crawl over them to stand up. I nudged them, but they didn't wake up. I walked out to the kitchen. La Gorda was sitting with the Genaros around the table. "Welcome back," Pablito said. He added that La Gorda had woken up a short while before. I felt that I was my old self again. I was hungry. La Gorda gave me a bowl of food. She said that they had already eaten. After eating, I felt perfect in every respect, except I could not think as I usually do. My thoughts had quieted down tremendously. I did not like that state. I noticed then that it was late afternoon. I had a sudden urge to jog in place facing the sun the way Don Juan used to make me do. I stood up and La Gorda joined me. Apparently she had had the same idea. Moving like that made me perspire. I got winded very quickly and returned to the table. La Gorda followed me. We sat down again. The Genaros were staring at us. La Gorda handed me my writing pad. "The Nagual here got us lost," La Gorda said. The moment she spoke, I experienced a most peculiar bursting. My thoughts came back to me in an avalanche. There must have been a change in my expression, for Pablito embraced me, and so did Nestor and Benigno. "The Nagual is going to live," Pablito said loudly. La Gorda also seemed delighted. She wiped her forehead in a gesture of relief. She said that I had nearly killed all of them, and myself, with my terrible tendency to indulge. "To focus the second attention is no joke," Nestor said. "What happened to us, Gorda?" I asked. "We got lost," she said. "You began to indulge in your fear, and we got lost in that immensity. We couldn't focus our attention of the tonal anymore, but we succeeded in bundling up our second attention with yours, and now you have two faces." Lydia, Rosa, and Josefina stepped out into the kitchen at that moment. They were smiling and seemed as fresh and vigorous as ever. They helped themselves to some food. They sat down, and nobody uttered a word while they ate. The moment the last one had finished eating, La Gorda picked up where she had left off. "Now you're a warrior with two faces," she went on. "The Nagual said that all of us have to have two faces to fare well in both attentions. He and Genaro helped us to round up our second attention and turned us around so we could face in two directions. But they didn't help you, because to be a true Nagual you have to claim your power all by yourself. You're still a long way from that, but Let's say that now you're walking upright instead of crawling, and when you've regained your completeness and have lost your form, you'll be gliding. Benigno made a gesture with his hand of a plane in flight and imitated the roar of the engine with his booming voice. The sound was truly deafening. Everybody laughed. The little sisters seemed to be delighted. I had not been fully aware until then that it was late afternoon. I said to La Gorda that we must have slept for hours, for we had gone into their room before noon. She said that we had not slept long at all, that most of that time we had been lost in the other world, and that the Genaros had been truly frightened and despondent because there was nothing they could do to bring us back. I turned to Nestor and asked him what they had actually done or seen while we were gone. He stared at me for a moment before answering. "We brought a lot of water to the yard," he said, pointing to some empty oil barrels. "Then all of you staggered into the yard and we poured water on you. That's all." "Did we come out of the room?" I asked him. Benigno laughed loudly. Nestor looked at La Gorda as if asking for permission or advice. "Did we come out of the room?" La Gorda asked. "No," Nestor replied. La Gorda seemed to be as anxious to know as I was, and that was alarming to me. She even coaxed Nestor to speak. "You came from nowhere," Nestor said. "I should also say that it was frightening. All of you were like fog. Pablito saw you first. You may have been in the yard for a long time, but we didn't know where to look for you. Then Pablito yelled, and all of us saw you. We've never seen anything like that." "What did we look like?" I asked. The Genaros looked at one another. There was an unbearably long silence. The little sisters were staring at Nestor with their mouths open. "You were like pieces of fog caught in a web," Nestor said. "When we poured water on you, you became solid again." I wanted him to keep on talking, but La Gorda said that there was very little time left, for I had to leave at the end of the day, and she still had things to tell me. The Genaros stood up and shook hands with the little sisters and La Gorda. They embraced me and told me that they only needed a few days in order to get ready to move away. Pablito put his chair upside down on his back. Josefina ran to the area around the stove, picked up a bundle they had brought from Doña Soledad's house, and placed it between the legs of Pablito's chair, which made an ideal carrying device. "Since you're going home, you might as well take this," she said. "It belongs to you anyway." Pablito shrugged his shoulders and shifted his chair in order to balance the load. Nestor signaled Benigno to take the bundle, but Pablito wouldn't let him. "It's all right," he said. "I might as well be a jackass as long as I'm carrying this damn chair." "Why do you carry it, Pablito?" I asked. "I have to store my power," he replied. "I can't go around sitting on just anything. Who knows what kind of a creep sat there before me?" He cackled and made the bundle wiggle by shaking his shoulders. After the Genaros left, La Gorda explained to me that Pablito began his crazy involvement with his chair to tease Lydia. He didn't want to sit where she had sat, but he'd gotten carried away, and since he loved to indulge, he wouldn't sit anywhere else except on his chair. "He's capable of carrying it through life," La Gorda said to me with great certainty. "He's almost as bad as you. He's your partner. You'll carry your writing pad through life, and he'll carry his chair. What's the difference? Both of you indulge more than the rest of us." The little sisters surrounded me and laughed, patting me on the back. "It's very hard to get into our second attention," La Gorda went on. "And to manage it when you indulge as you do is even harder. The Nagual said that you should know how difficult that managing is better than any of us. With his power plants, you learned to go very far into that other world. That's why you pulled us so hard today that we nearly died. We wanted to gather our second attention on the Nagual spot, and you plunged us into something we didn't know. We're not ready for it, but neither are you. You can't help yourself, though. The power plants made you that way. The Nagual was right. All of us have to help you contain your second attention, and you have to help all of us to push ours. Your second attention can go very far, but it has no control. Ours can go only a little bit, but we have absolute control over it. La Gorda and the little sisters, one by one, told me how frightening the experience of being lost in the other world had been. The Nagual told me, La Gorda went on, that when he was gathering your second attention with this smoke, you focused it on a gnat. And then the little gnat became the guardian of the other world for you. I told her that that was true. At her request, I narrated to them the experience Don Juan had made me undergo. With the aid of his smoking mixture, I had perceived a gnat as a 100-foot-high, horrifying monster that moved with incredible speed and agility. The ugliness of that creature was nauseating, and yet there was an awesome magnificence to it. I also had had no way to accommodate that experience in my rational scheme of things. The only support for my intellect was my deep-seated certainty that one of the effects of the psychotropic smoking mixture was to induce me to hallucinate the size of the gnat. I presented to them, especially to La Gorda, my rational, causal explanation of what had taken place. They laughed. There are no hallucinations, La Gorda said in a firm tone. If anybody suddenly sees something different, something that was not there before, it is because that person's second attention has been gathered and that person is focusing it on something. Now, whatever is gathering that person's attention might be anything. Maybe it's liquor, or maybe it's madness, or maybe it's the Nagual's smoking mixture. You saw a gnat, and it became the guardian of the other world for you. And do you know what that other world is? That other world is the world of our second attention. The Nagual thought that perhaps your second attention was strong enough to pass the guardian and go into that world, but it wasn't. If it had been, you might have gone into that world and never returned. The Nagual told me that he was prepared to follow you, but the guardian didn't let you pass and nearly killed you. The Nagual had to stop making you focus your second attention with his power plants because you could only focus on the awesomeness of things. He had you do dreaming instead so you could gather it in another way, but he was sure your dreaming would also be awesome. There was nothing he could do about it. You were following him in his own footsteps, and he had an awesome, fearsome side. They remained silent. It was as if all of them had been engulfed by their memories. La Gorda said that the Nagual had once pointed out to me a very special red insect in the mountains of his homeland. She asked me if I remembered it. I did remember it. Years before, Don Juan had taken me to an area unknown to me in the mountains of northern Mexico. With extreme care, he showed me some round insects the size of a ladybug. Their backs were brilliantly red. I wanted to get down on the ground and examine them, but he wouldn't let me. He told me that I should watch them, without staring, until I had memorized their shape, because I was supposed to remember them always. He then explained some intricate details of their behavior, making it sound like a metaphor. He was telling me about the arbitrary importance of our most cherished mores. He pointed out some alleged mores of those insects and pitted them against ours. The comparison made the importance of our beliefs look ridiculous. Just before he and Genaro left, La Gorda went on. The Nagual took me to that place in the mountains where those little bugs lived. I had already been there once, and so had everyone else. The Nagual made sure that all of us knew those little creatures, although he never let us gaze at them. While I was there with him, he told me what to do with you, and what I should tell you. I've already told you most of what he asked me to, except for this last thing. It has to do with what you've been asking everybody about. Where are the Nagual and Genaro? Now I'll tell you exactly where they are. The Nagual said that you will understand this better than any of us. None of us has ever seen the Guardian. None of us has ever been in that yellow sulfur world where he lives. You are the only one among us who has. The Nagual said that he followed you into that world when you focused your second attention on the Guardian. He intended to go there with you, perhaps forever, if you would have been strong enough to pass. It was then that he first found out about the world of those little red bugs. He said that their world was the most beautiful and perfect thing one could imagine. So when it was time for him and Genaro to leave this world, they gathered all their second attention and focused it on that world. Then the Nagual opened the crack, as you yourself witnessed, and they slipped through it into that world, where they are waiting for us to join them someday. The Nagual and Genaro liked beauty. They went there for their sheer enjoyment. She looked at me. I had nothing to say. She had been right in saying that power had to time her revelation perfectly if it were going to be effective. I felt an anguish I could not express. It was as if I wanted to weep, and yet I wasn't sad or melancholy. I longed for something inexpressible, but that longing was not mine. Like so many of the feelings and sensations I had had since my arrival, it was alien to me. Nestor's assertions about Eligio came to my mind. I told La Gorda what he had said, and she asked me to narrate to them the visions of my journey between the Tonal and the Nagual, which I had had upon jumping into the abyss. When I finished, they all seemed frightened. La Gorda immediately isolated my vision of the dome. The Nagual told us that our second attention would someday focus on that dome, she said. That day, we will be all second attention, just like the Nagual and Genaro are, and that day we will join them. Do you mean, Gorda, that we will go as we are? I asked. Yes, we will go as we are. The body is the first attention, the attention of the Tonal. When it becomes the second attention, it simply goes into the other world. Jumping into the abyss gathered all your second attention for a while, but Eligio was stronger, and his second attention was fixed by that jump. That's what happened to him, and he was just like all of us. But there's no way of telling where he is. Even the Nagual himself didn't know. But if he is someplace, he's in that dome. Or he's bouncing from vision to vision, perhaps for a whole eternity. La Gorda said that in my journey between the Tonal and the Nagual, I had corroborated on a grand scale the possibility that our whole being becomes all second attention. And on a much smaller scale, when I got all of them lost in the world of that attention earlier that day, and also when she transported us half a mile in order to flee from the Allies. She added that the problem the Nagual had left for us as a challenge was whether or not we would be capable of developing our will or the power of our second attention to focus indefinitely on anything we wanted. We were quiet for a while. It seemed that it was time for me to leave, but I couldn't move. The thought of Eligio's fate had paralyzed me. Whether he had made it to the dome of our rendezvous, or whether he had gotten caught in the tremendum, the image of his journey was maddening. It took no effort at all for me to envision it, for I had the experience of my own journey. The other world, which Don Juan had referred to practically since the moment we met, had always been a metaphor, an obscure way of labeling some perceptual distortion, or, at best, a way of talking about some undefinable state of being. Even though Don Juan had made me perceive indescribable features of the world, I could not consider my experiences to be anything beyond a play on my perception, a directed mirage of sorts that he had managed to make me undergo either by means of psychotropic plants or by means I could not deduce rationally. Every time that had happened, I had shielded myself with the thought that the unity of the me I knew and was familiar with had been only temporarily displaced. Inevitably, as soon as that unity was restored, the world became again the sanctuary for my inviolable, rational self. The scope that La Gorda had opened with her revelations was terrifying. She stood up and pulled me up off the bench. She said that I had to leave before the twilight set in. All of them walked with me to my car, and we said goodbye. La Gorda gave me a last command. She told me that on my return, I should go directly to the Gennaros' house. "We don't want to see you until you know what to do," she said, with a radiant smile. "But don't delay too long." The little sisters nodded. "Those mountains are not going to let us stay here much longer," she said, and with a subtle movement of her chin she pointed to the ominous eroded hills across the valley. I asked her one more question. I wanted to know if she had any idea where the Nagual and Genaro would go after we had completed our rendezvous. She looked up at the sky, raised her arms, and made an indescribable gesture with them to point out that there was no limit to that vastness.